Today I'm joined by Honourable Ginny Anderson, Minister of Justice.
Kia ora, Minister Andersen. Thank you for joining me and welcome to the Impact Statement.
Thank you very much for having me along today, and kia ora.
Kia ora. So as we near the election, there's always lots of talk about crime, but I'm conscious, and we're conscious at Victim Support, that behind every crime there's at least one victim. So political parties are telling us that victims matter leading into the election. And I'm just wondering, in your own words, why do victims matter to you?
Well, victims profoundly matter. They're at the heart of every single justice issue. And the more that we can have a justice system that puts victims at the centre, then our justice system will improve. I guess a victim-centric approach also holds the key to better align our justice system. I've been able to sit around one of those big tables where we have corrections, police, courts, justice, all of those different departments, which all have their own kind of brain, for want of a better word, and their own goals and their own outcomes that they're pursuing. And I think the key to having a more efficient, a more effective justice system is that if we put victims in the central, then that's one language that all of those different departments are able to recognise and speak. So it's not only important just for victims' rights, but I think it's also important for our whole justice system.
Yeah, I agree with you, because victimisation doesn't just impact one aspect of a victim's life, it actually impacts every aspect. So the more agencies that you've got involved in that victim's journey, the more impact you can actually have.
Yeah, definitely so. And we know that empathy and support for victims, it not only helps a victim to heal through what they've been through, but it also helps restore trust in our justice system. And that's what we have to do.
Exactly, because trust is quite low at the moment in the justice system, would you say? You know, like the latest New Zealand Crime and Victims Survey, only 19% of crime was reported. That's dropped from, it's always been hovering around 25%, which was quite low anyway. So what do you think we can do for victims that would improve that reporting of crime and improve that trust and confidence in the justice system?
Well, essentially it's to improve their experience through the process that they've engaged in. And so court delays is just one area that we've been working to try and speed up those delays. We've still not caught back up after the backlog from COVID, and we know that that long drawn out process it just increases the trauma for victims. Saying that too, we've made some really good changes that have tried to improve the experience, particularly for areas like sexual violence, where we know that the process itself can be really traumatic for women, having to relive the experience, having to be questioned and cross-examined. So some of the changes we've done through the Sexual Violence Legislation Act enables those complainants to use alternative ways of giving evidence, including pre-recording. So they're not in that situation where you're being hard, cross-examined in a situation. And it also makes sure that evidence about someone's past sex life is off limits unless it's really critical to the case. So quite often you see women being cross-examined about their sexual history, which just is, as far as I can see, not relevant to what's being what the court is actually examining at that point in time. So I think those while they're small changes, we've really been focused on improving the experience of people who are going through that system. And I really hope that if we continue to improve that experience, that in itself will help to increase the rate of reporting that we're seeing now.
Yeah, that's right. And, you know, with the sexual violence legislation changes that have been made recently, I was just speaking to a sexual violence victim recently, and she said, oh gosh, I wish that was the case when I went through the court system. You know, she actually said, even though what had happened to her was absolutely horrific, she said her court experience was even more distressing and traumatizing than the actual event itself. And that's really saying something. And so for her, if she had been able to give her testimony pre-recorded and not have to sit there and face the offender, that would have made the world of difference. So yeah, that's definitely something really meaningful.
Yeah, another thing that is just being announced this afternoon, so hopefully you won't screen this recording, because otherwise I'll get in trouble for letting the cat out of the bag.
No, we won't be.
We're actually going to take a good look at consent. So we
Yes.
know that the issue of consent in our legislation is quite out of date compared to some other jurisdictions, and the way it's framed in our law currently is in a negative way. So we want to frame it up and so like what is not consent. So we want to frame it up as what is consent and modernise our consent law. So that's just another way that we're continuing to take a look at, is our law fit for purpose? Is it encouraging people to want to come forward and report? And are we enabling them to have as many protections as possible going through what is a really challenging time in the courts?
Yeah, that's right. So sort of looking at procedural justice for victims when they're in the justice system itself, when they're in court, making the experience. This sounds crazy, but I was at a forum recently with some young people, and we were given problems, real world social issues to look at. And our group was given the issue with the justice system. And these young people, they were teenagers, said, we need to make the courts a fun place to be so that kids and young people actually want to go there. And I just thought those words, I mean, courts might not ever be fun, but kind of just a place where you feel that that the system is on your side rather than against you, even that would make a huge difference.
And I think it goes to the heart that our court system is a adversarial one. It's the idea of holding something up to the light and challenging it in order to establish, getting a sense of what has happened and to do that. And so that the nature of the system itself does not assist victims to have a positive experience. So we really need to take a good look at some of those fundamental ways, ensuring access to justice, ensuring people get all the rights they are entitled to, but at the same time putting a real lens over all of those steps to say, how does the victim feel in this situation? How would you feel if this had happened to you and you were sitting in that spot? And so to continually take a step back and put yourself in the victim's shoes is what we should be doing every step of the way.
Exactly. And that to me sounds like a great definition of what it means to be victim-centric, would you say?
Yeah, it would. Yeah. No, I'm really passionate about making improvements. And I know it's a really difficult area to make sure we get that balance right. But I think we've got a whole lot of more things that we can do. I'm really proud of the Te Ao Rere Kura. That's a piece of work that Marama Davidson has been the minister responsible for, but that's actually for the first time enabled some of our community NGOs who do that great work in preventing sexual violence and preventing family violence to be resourced enough to be able to do that good work in the community that we need to make sure that if people are reaching out for help, that they're getting that. So Te Ao Rere Kura is really enabling our community to take a greater ownership over addressing some of these long-term issues that typically it's more women and children have been at the end of those victimisations.
Yeah, exactly. So the government, Labor's been in power for quite some time, so you've had the opportunity to see lots of changes, and you've mentioned the sexual violence legislation, and there are a couple of bills before Parliament at the moment also, which are going to potentially make things better for victims. So if Labor was re-elected, what do you think would be the next step then for victims, and how we can continue to support them?
So we've just said that in the last week or so, we would like to see explore the ability of a new offence for stalking. We know that there's been instances where there's been continual harassment of women, and it's quite difficult in law to be able to prove that. So other jurisdictions have been successful in introducing a law or an offence specific to stalking. So we've undertaken to do that work. The one I just mentioned earlier, modernising our consent laws. We've had really strong advocacy from some groups at our Justice Committee coming forward and presenting a petition. We know that there's strong support in the community for modernising our consent laws. So that's something else that we will do. And then there's another one that we're taking a look at that's going to be announced shortly, and that's establishing a formal class actions regime. So So for victims of crime in other countries, they're able to take a class action. And this is really useful in situations where it's kind of like the small person can't fight the big company. So enabling a whole bunch of people so one would be potentially like something like leaky homes or something like this. There's been a big issue and a lot of people have been affected. So, and it can actually work in instances, a whole range of areas. So having the ability to take class action further empowers people who might be disempowered by the justice system because they're prohibited through cost or for other reasons.
Yeah. Absolutely, exactly. And that's a huge thing to think about, really. And just giving victims that option is important. You know, wherever you've got options for victims, I think that's also being victim-centric.
Yeah.
Because,
the other one I just want to add in, because
yeah.
I'm quite proud of this one, is
Yeah.
and it doesn't, I find it really interesting that generally in the conversations around law and order, there's a lot of emphasis on, you know, let's get tougher and, you know, let's have longer sentences or let's do this. But and there's the natural conclusion is because this is good for victims, but there's not a lot of discussion about what's actually being done for victims. And then when we go to talk about it, I just find it's really hard to get a level of interest out there sometimes about some of the good things that can be done to really improve things for victims. One of the heartening things I've seen is since we've introduced giving sexual violence victims more control around the processes of their name suppression, is that I've seen women deciding that I don't want name suppression and I want I want the offender named as well. That's a huge thing, you know, to be that strong to say, yes, this happened to me and this is who I am, and it's that person who did it. And so I think that's really empowering for victims, and to be able to own that and to tell your story in your victim impact statement and to have that story told. And I've been really encouraged by the number of female journalists who are really actively reporting on when that is happening and trying to give that a bit more airtime.
Yeah, exactly. That's excellent, isn't it? Because it's getting away from that idea that by default victims don't want to have their names suppressed. Do need to have their names suppressed because it's almost insinuating perhaps that there could even be some shame associated with it. You know, victim blaming, victim shaming. And again, it's just about choice. And for many victims, they may never want to have their name associated with that crime, which is absolutely understandable. But what about having a choice? Because you don't have a choice when you're a victim of crime. You just don't. And so whatever follows that, it makes sense that wherever you've got an option for a choice, that should be allowed, that should be encouraged.
Yeah, that's your choice. That's exactly right. That if you don't want, that's fine. If you don't want, you know, but if you do, it shouldn't be automatic name suppression and someone else is, again, taking that power away from you.
Right.
That's your right to be able to say who you are and what happened to you if you want to do that.
Exactly. Yeah. So just one last thing. I mean, you mentioned before tough on crime, and, you know, that's the rhetoric that we hear a lot of going into any election, and I'm sure it's the same in any country. Where do you think victims fit into that piece of that conversation, getting tough on crime?
Well, if a victim of crime always, you know, it's hard to speak without, if you're talking about a specific crime, people are always going to have a huge amount of pain, and a natural outcome from being a victim of crime is wanting to see punishment or retribution of the offender who has done this to you or your family. So it's a natural reaction. And so I think it's really important to state that as a government, we haven't changed any sentencing. There seems to be this kind of rhetoric going around that we've somehow made sentences different, that the penalty for rape is exactly the same, the penalty for manslaughter and murder is exactly the same. So we haven't changed any sentences, but what we have done is bringing a range of measures that not only support victim support by increasing the funding to victim support, but also the Victims Assistance Scheme, so enabling more counselling, more support, more advocacy by empowering victims and having access to those services that enables victims to have far more power and control over a process that can be typically disempowering. And I think it's quite, I have to point out that while some of those parties who are, you know, advocating for being, you know, even tougher on crime, you know, when they were in power, they cut funding to victim support. You know, the amount of funding going to those services decreased. And so that's not serving victims of crime to stop them having access to all of those good services that should be putting victims at the centre of any decision-making process.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure whether this has been shared with you, but in our latest victim support consumer evaluation, we actually found that 37% of victims said they likely would have dropped out of the justice system if it hadn't have been for the support they had from victim support. Yeah. And so, you know, if you really want to get tough on crime, another approach to take is give victims more support so they actually feel supported to go through the justice system. You know, that conviction often can't happen if the victim isn't party to that, if they're not participating.
That's right. That's so right. And I think for every victim that goes through that journey and goes through the system, you know, I think that makes it that much easier for the next victim. So while it's a tough experience, the more that people go through that, the more that we can tell those stories and encourage other people to step forward and report when otherwise they might have carried that in silence.
Yeah, fantastic. Minister Anderson, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. And thank you for all the awesome work you do. You do a great job. So
thanks so much.